You feel the marble cool beneath your sandals. The lamplight flickers across golden dishes, still warm from the feast. Around you, senators and their wives smile too carefully, laugh too quickly. The emperor rises. No speech comes, only silence. He moves behind the chairs, fingers trailing the edge of the table. Then he stops. His hand lifts your wife's chin. He examines her teeth like a merchant inspecting a horse. Your throat tightens. You do not move. You cannot move. He nods once. The guards step forward. She is led from the hall, looking back only once, her eyes searching yours for permission you cannot give. You remain. You eat. You smile. An hour becomes an eternity. Then he returns, bringing her with him. He sits, drinks deeply, and begins to speak in graphic, vulgar detail about her body, her responses, her inadequacies, while staring directly into your eyes, demanding you acknowledge every word. Before we descend further into this darkness, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It honestly astounds me that a story this uncomfortable, this raw, from 2,000 years ago, still reaches people across every continent. This was Rome in the year 39 AD. The man conducting this psychological vivisection was Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known to history as Caligula, meaning little boots, a childhood nickname that would come to drip with bitter irony. When he ascended to the purple in March of 37 AD, Rome wept with joy. He was the son of Germanicus, the empire's most beloved general, the great-grandson of Augustus himself. The Senate declared 20 days of Thanksgiving. Citizens slaughtered animals in the streets in celebration. They believed they were entering a golden age. What they received instead was a 47-month masterclass in the weaponization of desire, a systematic program of sexual humiliation designed not from madness, but from terrifying clarity. The ancient historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio, writing from first-hand senatorial accounts, did not record the ravings of a lunatic. They documented the blueprint of a tyrant who understood that the fastest way to destroy powerful men was not to kill their bodies, but to defile their honor, violate their families, and force them to witness it all. While smiling, Caligula's strategy began with the most sacred foundation of Roman civilization, the family, the domos. To a Roman aristocrat, honor was not individual. It was inherited, maintained, and passed down through bloodlines stretching back centuries. Virtue was dynastic, and so Caligula began his war by demolishing his own. Ancient sources report that he engaged in incestuous relationships with all three of his sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Julia Livilla. But his obsession centered on Drusilla, the middle sister. This was not hidden. It was performed. At state banquets, with the Senate assembled, he seated her in the place reserved for the empress, the place his own wife should have occupied. He would caress her openly, kiss her mouth in front of Rome's elite, forcing them to watch the defilement of blood sanctity. The question is not whether this happened. The sources are too consistent. The question is why he made it public. The answer lies in psychology, not lust. He was conducting an experiment. How much could Rome's ruling class endure before they broke? How far could he push them into complicity? When Drusilla died suddenly in 38 AD, possibly from fever, possibly from something darker, Caligula's grief became another weapon. He forced the Senate to declare her a goddess diva Drusilla. He compelled the most powerful men in the world to kneel before altars and pray to the partner in his own incest. He transformed witnesses into accomplices. He had erased the honor of his own bloodline and now he was coming for theirs. The second phase of his campaign was the political castration of Rome's aristocracy. The dinner inspections, horrifying as they were, served as preliminary terror. His true genius lay in the creation of the imperial palace brothel, an institution so calculated in its cruelty that it defies easy comprehension. Caligula converted an entire wing of the Palatine Palace, the sacred heart of imperial authority, into a state-appointed brothel. But the women forced to serve there were not slaves or freedwomen, the traditional suppliers of such commerce. They were the free-born wives and daughters of senatorial families, women of the highest social rank. Caligula became the empire's pimp-in-chief. Suetonius observes, with barely suppressed horror, that the emperor meticulously recorded the brothels, income in official ledgers, documenting client names and the prices paid for each encounter. Picture the psychological architecture of this system. A senator, a man who might command legions or govern provinces, would be summoned to the palace. He would enter a room and find his colleague's wife, or perhaps his own daughter, presented as merchandise. He would pay a fee recorded in the emperor's personal accounts. The transaction transformed him from a pillar of Roman virtue into a client in a ledger, an entry in an accounting book. This was not about revenue. The imperial treasury hardly needed brothel income. This was about creating a written record of humiliation, a permanent archive of degradation that could be referenced, whispered about, wielded as blackmail. Every man who participated became a hostage to his own shame. Every man who refused risked being marked as disloyal, with consequences that extended far beyond mere embarrassment. The third layer of Caligula's systematic assault was the performance of impulse, the demonstration that no moment of private joy was safe from his whim. The incident at the wedding of Gaius Piso has become infamous, but its strategic meaning is often overlooked. Caligula attended as an invited guest, arriving with full ceremony. The bride, Livia Orestilla, entered in her wedding regalia, prepared to join her life to Piso's. Caligula watched the ceremony begin. Then, without warning, without explanation, he rose and stopped the ritual. He seized Livia from her husband's side, declared that he was marrying her instead, and had the ceremony redirected to himself. The wedding continued with a different groom. The next day, he divorced her. Days later, he banished her from Rome entirely. The act seems insane until you understand its purpose. This was not about desire for Livia specifically. It was about demonstrating that no bond, no vow, no sanctified moment was beyond his reach. The message to every Roman aristocrat was clear. Your marriage ceremony could be interrupted, your children's futures rewritten, your most intimate family moments invaded at any second based on nothing more than imperial impulse. The unpredictability was the point. A tyrant who acts consistently can be predicted and perhaps managed. A tyrant who acts on theatrical whim cannot be anticipated, cannot be defended against, and therefore keeps his subjects in permanent psychological paralysis. The fourth weapon in his arsenal was identity erasure, the public stripping of social definition. During the gladiatorial games, the greatest spectacles of Roman public life, Caligula would force aristocratic senators and their wives into the arena, but not to fight. Cassius Dio records that they were compelled to perform sexually explicit acts in front of the roaring crowd. The same common mob that these aristocrats ruled, taxed, and commanded. To understand the horror of this, you must understand Roman social hierarchy. A senator was not merely wealthy or powerful. He was a living embodiment of dignitas, a complex concept encompassing authority, reputation, and ancestral honor. To be reduced to a sexual performer for the entertainment of the unwashed masses was a fate worse than execution. Death could be noble. This was the annihilation of meaning. When a senator left that arena, if he left it at all, he left as something fundamentally different. He had been transformed from subject to object, from person to spectacle. His identity had been publicly consumed. His colleagues had watched, his slaves had watched, his slaves had watched. How do you command a legion after the common soldiers have seen you debased for their amusement? How do you conduct Senate business when every man in the chamber remembers what you were forced to perform? Caligula understood that some wounds never heal because they redefine the wounded. But there was a fifth weapon, one often obscured by the more theatrical public scandals, one that worked in shadow and silence: the political deployment of sexual assault against powerful men themselves. Suetonius reports that Caligula would target high-ranking consular senators, older men of established reputation and influence, and have them brought to his private chambers. What occurred there was not recorded in explicit detail by the prudish Roman historians, but the implications are clear and devastating. In a society that defined masculine virtue as dominance, control, and impenetrability, the forced sexual subjugation of these men was the ultimate annihilation. It left no visible scar. It generated no public spectacle, but it permanently shattered the psychological foundation of his victims. More insidiously, Caligula would boast of these encounters afterward, describing his victims in graphic, humiliating detail to his inner circle, ensuring that the assault extended beyond the physical act into lasting social degradation. This was his most effective weapon precisely because it was his most secret. The victims could not speak of it without confirming their own violation. They could not seek sympathy without admitting their debasement. They were trapped in silence, their power corroded from within, while their public facades remained intact. This is the signature of sophisticated cruelty, the wound that cannot be shown. The final thematic layer of Caligula's reign was the inevitable next step for any tyrant who has already conquered mortals. He turned his assault toward the divine. After declaring himself a living god, building temples to his own divinity, and demanding worship from the Senate, breaking human beings was no longer sufficient. His targets became the Vestal Virgins, the 6 priestesses who tended the sacred flame of Vesta and represented the spiritual purity of Rome itself. These women were chosen as children and sworn to 30 years of absolute chastity. To violate a Vestal was the gravest sacrilege in Roman religion, punishable by being buried alive for the woman and beaten to death for the man. Their virginity was not personal, it was civic. It protected Rome's very existence. The sources, particularly the scandalized Christian historians, who wrote centuries later, allege that Caligula summoned these virgins to his chambers one by one and violated them systematically. Whether this occurred exactly as described or was amplified by later moralists. The allegation itself reveals the logical endpoint of his program. If you have already demonstrated that no family is safe, no marriage sacred, no senator immune, the only remaining boundary to cross is the divine itself. By targeting the Vestals, he was proving that not even Rome's direct connection to the gods could resist his will. He was declaring himself not merely above the Senate, but above the cosmic order. This was not madness. This was the completion of a thesis. For 4 years, Rome endured. The reason was not acceptance, but terror. Caligula had built an architecture of fear that made resistance nearly impossible. He maintained a network of informers who reported even whispered criticism. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor, had been lavished with bonuses and privileges, binding them to his survival. To criticize Caligula was to invite not just your own death, but the destruction of your entire family line. Your property would be confiscated, your name would be erased from public records, your children would be sold into slavery. The stakes of resistance were total. And yet, paradoxically, the regime built on the systematic humiliation of others contained the seeds of its own destruction, planted not in grand conspiracy, but in small, personal indignity. The man who finally killed Caligula was Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard, a decorated soldier with a distinguished record. He had served emperors and survived battles. He was not a senator nursing wounded family honor. He was a professional military officer. And Caligula had mocked him relentlessly for having a high-pitched voice in front of other soldiers, in front of subordinates. The emperor would imitate Chaerea's voice, call him effeminate, question his manhood. When Chaerea came for the daily watchword, the password required for guard duty, Caligula would give him obscene words like Priapus or Venus, forcing him to repeat sexually humiliating phrases as part of his official duty. This was the crack in the armor. The man who had institutionalized incest operated a palace brothel, defiled the aristocracy, and violated the Vestals, was ultimately brought down by petty, repeated personal insult. It is a deeply human irony. The grand crimes became normalized through scale and repetition, but the small daily humiliation, the constant belittling, created the one thing more dangerous than fear: personal hatred nurtured over time into cold resolve. On January 24th, 41 AD, Chaerea and a group of co-conspirators cornered Caligula in a narrow underground corridor beneath the Palatine Palace. The emperor had been watching theatrical performances. He was walking alone, briefly separated from his German bodyguards. Chaerea struck first, driving his sword into Caligula's shoulder. The living god screamed. Other conspirators swarmed. They stabbed him more than 30 times. He died on the marble floor, his blood pooling in the cold dimness. His voice, which had once commanded empires and orchestrated horrors, reduced to choking gasps. The man who had spent 4 years demonstrating that no one was safe died, discovering that he, too, was mortal. His wife was killed immediately after. His infant daughter's head was smashed against a wall. The conspirators were taking no chances. The bloodline had to end completely. Rome did not mourn. The Senate briefly debated restoring the Republic, a fantasy they entertained for mere hours before the Praetorian Guard located Caligula's uncle, Claudius, hiding behind a curtain in the palace, and declared him emperor at sword point. The machine of imperial power continued. The structures Caligula had perverted remained. The precedents he had set, the boundaries he had shattered, could not be unbroken. Future emperors would remember that the aristocracy had endured 4 years of systematic sexual degradation and done nothing until a soldier with a wounded ego took action. They would remember that humiliation could be institutionalized. They would remember that sacred boundaries once crossed became mere suggestions. The historical record of Caligula forces an uncomfortable recognition. His reign was not the chaos of insanity, it was the precision of cruelty wielded by someone who understood that power, at its most effective, does not kill the body. It kills the soul. It transforms witnesses into accomplices, creates shame too deep to voice, and builds systems where the humiliated participate in their own degradation because the alternative is annihilation. The sources that document his reign written by senators and historians who lived through it or interviewed survivors, do not describe random madness. They describe method. They describe a man who looked at the most powerful elite in the world and asked a simple question: what would it take to make them kneel, not through force, but through shame? And then he answered it systematically for 47 months, until a soldier who had been mocked one too many times ended the experiment with a blade. The final image that survives in the historical record is not of Caligula's death, but of what happened immediately after. His body was hastily cremated, partially burned, and buried in a shallow grave in the gardens of the Lamian family. Months later, his sisters, the same women he had publicly defiled, returned from exile. They exhumed his remains, burned them properly, and gave them a decent burial. Even after everything, even after he had weaponized their bodies and honor in his war against Rome, the bonds of blood demanded the ritual. It is a haunting grace note. The man who had spent his reign proving that nothing was sacred was given sacred rights by the very people he had most profoundly violated. History does not record what they thought as they performed those rituals. We are left only with the act itself and the question it poses: what is left of love after it has been used as a weapon, and why does it persist even then?